Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our monthly meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board, and we'll start out with introductions and any new declarations, and I'll first go to Joy on the phone.
Joy Zedler, no changes.
And then start this way with Tom.
No changes.
Vince Resch, no changes.
Liz Kenuel, no changes.
Steve Brandt, no changes.
Jay Lund, no changes.
John Weens, nothing new here.
Tracy Collier, no new confessions to make.
Joe Fernand, no changes.
Okay, thanks everyone. We'll start off with item number 2 then, move on to item number 2, which is the chair's report. And I just first want to, everyone knows it, but we had a fantastic day yesterday in the central Delta and went out for boat rides, and I want to thank John Burrow and particularly the USGS. It was really fabulous. We learned a lot, we saw a lot, and ask Jay to give us sort of a recap.
It was a really great trip. These trips are always excellent. I highly recommend that any of you ever have an opportunity to get out into the Delta, that you go there, particularly with some of the experienced scientists that have lots of observations over long periods of time. Right outside of here is Georgiana Slough. I didn't understand until yesterday that 70% of all the turbidity in the central Delta comes from Georgiana Slough, particularly during this time of year, when the cross-channel gates are closed, as they are now. So that's very important for the ecosystem and the phytoplankton and all things like that in the Delta. So all sorts of interesting little things. And that's just one of them.
Okay, just a reminder that if there's any public comments, to fill out a blue form and give them to Edmund up front here. And the overview of today's agenda, we plan to end around 12:30 today. We'll have a council report. We'll talk about the DPIIC, what we've been doing with DPIIC over the last few weeks. A report from the Delta lead scientist. We'll have our election of a new chair. And after a break, then go into our discussion of the various reviews that we have underway and talk about upcoming meetings. And then I've been asked to give some reflections as the outgoing chair, and then we'll adjourn. So without further ado, we'll go on to having the council report. And Susan and Jessica are here, and thanks for coming all the way down here.
Certainly. It was a beautiful drive. Thanks for having me. The April meeting for the council was very productive. We had a great workshop on ecosystem amendment to the Delta plan, and a few of the council members were complimentary and expressed that they really appreciate how well organized. They appreciated how well organized the presentation of this proposed amendment was, and Jessica will be saying more about it, but I just wanted to point out that a couple of the council's questions centered on how federal policies would affect implementation of the ecosystem amendment. In particular, one question was about the president's memo and the accelerated process on the biological opinions. And another question had to do with how the Army Corps of Engineers policy about vegetation on levees would affect our proposed ecosystem strategy. And we didn't have any immediate answers, but we'll be thinking about that. Another set of questions centered on the proposed disclosure form, and Jessica will tell you more about that. There's a form that project proponents would complete that would help us gather data on the contribution that a proposed ecosystem project would make to multiple benefits. On another item, the DPIIC item at the council meeting, Amanda Bowl highlighted the outcomes of the last DPIIC meeting, during which DPIIC authorized a working group to develop options for carrying out the recommendations in the science funding white paper and the ISB letter, the February letter sent to DPIIC. Finally, well, not finally, funding, getting to funding, the council authorized $2,046,580 in a new 3-year contract for California Sea Grant. Very happy that they saw fit to do that. And precedent-setting authorization on the joint proposal solicitation process that John Callaway put a lot of heart and soul into. And that authorized $9,645,959 to go to 15 science projects that qualified under some pretty stringent criteria. And I think I heard that it's been 10 years since those kinds of dollars were devoted to research. So I'd say it was a really productive council meeting, and I'll turn to Jessica for more details on the ecosystem amendment.
Good morning. So we spent about 2 hours at the council meeting going through a draft policy document with the council members. All of the information is online, and of course the record of the 2-hour discussion. So if you, I'll send you there for additional details. But there were a few things that we presented. So one was the draft policy document, or it was really it's a set of preliminary policies that we've asked for feedback from the council members on. I can talk a little bit about the core strategies that are in there. And then also an appendix that goes along with the policies, and this is the disclosure form that Susan referenced. So Appendix 2, it's in the materials. This is this is one of the newer aspects of what we're proposing as a part of the ecosystem amendment. It's a form that asks project proponents as a part of the covered actions process to go through and fill out information related to both common attributes and priority attributes of the project. And I can go through those in a little bit more detail if you have any questions, but the purpose of this form is really to start to gather more information about what restoration projects are doing on the ground. Are they interconnected? Are they creating more hydrological connections between land and water? Are they supporting native species? And it's really tying into the core strategy around supporting ecosystem function on the landscape. An important part of that form and that appendix is asking the project proponents to provide additional information about the social benefits of the individual projects, the restoration projects. That's something that has been a theme throughout the ecosystem amendment process. It was a major component of one of the synthesis papers, and we're really interested in understanding more about not only how projects are contributing to not just increasing ecosystem function, but really creating social benefit, whether it's recreation, improving water quality, so on and so forth. So that's the proposal. I'd invite you to review the appendix. If you have any questions, please let me or Ron Melser know. Stepping back from that just for a minute, there are 5 preliminary core strategies. You'll see that in the documentation. Create more natural functional flows. That's pretty much exactly the same as the 2013 chapter. We really haven't changed that. Restore ecosystem function. In 2013, the core strategy was restore habitat. Again, we're shifting to much more of a focus on function. 3 is protect land for restoration and safeguard against land loss. One of the new themes that we're proposing in this amendment is to focus much more on subsidence and subsidence reversal as an issue. And so you'll see policies and recommendations related to that and related to state agencies doing land management plans around subsidence and creating additional funding sources to do subsidence reversal projects. This is a main priority right now for the Conservancy. If you've spoken with Campbell Ingram, the executive officer there, he's very focused on subsidence reversal and carbon protocols and trying to create market incentives to do subsidence reversal projects on the landscape. Number 4 is protect native species and reduce the impact of non-native species. This was 2 separate core strategies. I know this is a topic that is of great interest to you. We've combined those two strategies into one and have a set of policies and recommendations in there. We feel that the recommendations are reflective of the current priorities of other state agencies, but we'd certainly like some feedback on those. And then the fifth is improve institutional coordination to support implementation. Again, this is one of the major themes for the ecosystem amendment, both restoring function and then improving state agency and state, local, and federal agencies' ability to get projects implemented on the ground and really to get out of our own way and reduce the barriers to implementation as much as possible. So there was a pretty good discussion at DPIIC on April 8th about removal of, working together to remove barriers to implementation for restoration projects, if you remember that discussion. A small, very informal set of us who have been working on the ecosystem amendment so far are going to start to meet and just to start to draft and look at a charge of what that working group for DPIIC might be moving forward. But there are some key points that are really important: removing barriers to permitting, making sure that funding mechanisms are in place, that there's really a portfolio of options to be funding restoration projects, not just in the short term, but also in the long term. So that's the overview of the core strategies. All of the materials are online. This is, I'm just going to waive this because it's not ready for review yet, but our goal is to get the full chapter, including performance measures and the policy options, to the council at the June meeting, and then we'll have at least a 30-day public review of the materials, if not longer. And then this is all preliminary prior to starting and initiating CEQA, which we'll initiate later in the fall. And that's the overview. At the next presentation at the council meeting, I think we got really good feedback from the council members. It was really helpful, and I think they've identified a few. Susan talked a little bit about it, but there's definitely some themes that we'll highlight when we come back in June. So this issue of disclosure, federal engagement, funding are some of the things that we'll be talking about. We'll also be talking more about how the proposed policies and recommendations would be affecting covered actions, and probably walk through an example of what that looks like for a covered action. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica and Susan. I have one comment and then a question. The comment is that we are making progress on our non-native species review, and I think a lot of it would relate to your strategy number 4. Unfortunately, we won't be done by June, so the time scales may be different. But bear in mind that we're diving into that fairly heavily right now. The other comment, or the question is that one of the synthesis papers was on climate change, and how does that weave into the ecosystem amendment?
So climate change we've focused the discussion of climate change. It's really woven throughout the policies and recommendations, so you'll see it within pretty much all of the core strategies have some mention of climate change and some consideration of it. And it's heavily addressed in core strategy 3, protecting against land loss and against subsidence reversal. But it's embedded throughout the narrative. And is very much front of mind.
Okay.
Yep.
Tom.
Jessica, could you say a little bit more about the subsidence reversal strategy, what the content of that is?
Let me, I didn't bring a PowerPoint, but give me 1 second to flip through and find what we have in there. So there's a few ways that it's addressed. One, there's a current elevation map in the chapter, ERP2, that looks at elevation where intertidal restoration opportunities would be, where there's opportunities for intertidal restoration. And that map we've updated with new sea level rise projections. And on that map, it identifies where areas for subsidence reversal would be likely be most successful based on intertidal elevation. So that's one aspect of it. So that's ERP2. If you have it's slide 27 and 28 in the PowerPoint, and then under core strategy 2. And then the other piece of it, there's two recommendations. Recommendation C, which is to fund targeted subsidence reversal actions. And then E, develop and update management plans to halt or reverse subsidence on public lands. The first recommendation, C, the fund targeted subsidence reversal actions, it's a two-part recommendation. The first part of it is to encourage new funding sources, development of new funding sources, ideally market-based funding to get subsidence reversal projects in the ground and to really be able to utilize carbon markets to support that work. The second part of that is identifying that where habitat restoration projects have the opportunity to do subsidence reversal projects, that those should be included, and that funding sources for restoration projects should not just go to subsidence reversal projects, but they should be ones where it's at appropriate elevations and can also restore other habitat functions. So that's that one. It's sort of a two-pronged funding strategy. And then the other is update management plans to halt or reverse subsidence. There's been a lot of work over the last 2 years. The Conservancy has been a lead on this, but to look at the public lands in the Delta and identify opportunities for restoration. So there's a public land strategy that came out from the Delta Conservancy. That's a really great opportunity to be looking at all of these lands together and to be identifying more programmatic approaches to be doing subsidence reversal. We know that that's something that's really important from the community perspective as well. Subsidence is a huge issue, and state agencies can really take a first step on that by looking at their own land management plans.
Okay, so it sounds like it's a combination of market-based strategies.
Market-based
and,
strategies, yep, and management.
Thank
Yeah, Tracy?
So I just had a question for Susan, asking, maybe looking for a comment on yesterday's announcement about water fix and going back to a single tunnel design. Is that going to, I'm just curious how far back in the process it has to go to restart that examination, and then, it's not for me because I'll be off the board by then, but is the board going to have to get involved in that new process? I mean, we were statutorily required to look at BDCP, which has been gone for a while now. I'm just curious, and you probably can't say much at this point, but I'm curious your views.
Well, you're correct. I can't say much at this point. I don't know how far back they'll have to go in terms of design. I do know that all the documentation, environmental documentation for water fix is to be archived. But I don't know the full meaning of that. And I'm sure we'll be learning more in the next few weeks. In terms of Delta ISB review, that's a good question. The statutory mandate was for BDCP, but with the separation of the ecosystem component from the conveyance component, I would hope that there is an opportunity for Delta ISB to review the proposed design and the best available science used to support that design and to support the mitigation. I don't have any definitive answers right now, but I will let you know what I hear as I hear more.
Okay.
I'm guessing, and I'd be interested in your sense of it, is we wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't have an EIR for us to look at for a couple of years.
That's what I would imagine. I don't think that they'd be able to use the previous material, but I don't know for sure. I unfortunately did not delve into all of the tens of thousands of pages on the EIR, but yeah, at least a year, I would imagine, redoing the documentation, or actually developing the new documentation for the modified facility. And I would add that The announcement on the water portfolio strategy is emphasizing that under this administration, we're taking a more holistic approach. And I imagine that a conveyance is just one component in that water portfolio strategy, and the first step is, as stated in the executive order, the assessment of all the other components where we are today, and that should inform the development of the overall strategy.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jessica and Susan. And any public comment on this item? All right, we'll move on to the next item, which is a discussion of DPIIC and our letter to DPIIC. As you recall, in February, we sent a letter to DPIIC requesting some action be taken in terms of, as a result of our review of the updated Delta Science Plan. And I want to thank Susan and Amanda in particular for jumping on that letter and taking action to make things happen after that, and responding to us and inviting us to the next DPIIC meeting, and as well as having pre-meetings ahead of time to make sure that our concerns and interests were represented at the DPIIC meeting. So at that DPIIC meeting, we Jay and I and Dick went, and we were on a panel shared jointly with Randy and Amanda and another person on the talking about the funding letter. So we were being the funding strategy letter and our letter were on a panel together, and we had an open discussion, and the recommendation of DPIIC in particular, the action they take was, I'm going to read it, was to endorse a science funding and governance work group to explore the options for implementing the recommendations in the science funding white paper and the Delta ISB's letter to DPIIC, and also to recommend options for implementing key components of the white paper and the Delta ISB recommendations. So I view that as taking our letter as equally important as the funding letter that came up. And so immediately after that, a large work group was held. There was a number of folks who are participating in the large work group, which at this stage is a joint work group. I don't know how many, Amanda could probably know, but at least 30, maybe 40 folks involved in that large work group, and Randy initiated that. And we had our first meeting, and the result of that was to set up 4 sub-work groups. And those sub-work groups, 3 of those dealt with issues that were related to the funding initiative, and 1 specifically related to our recommendation for a scientific needs assessment. And then members of that 40 or so group were split up into the various subgroups with a subgroup chair. And the concept is that each of these subgroups would begin their work immediately to try and take action on the recommendations to develop ways forward on how to implement those recommendations that were in those documents, and so that they would have a draft recommendations available sometime in August, and then by September actually have sort of a joint, fully completed recommendation that would go to the DPIIC, I believe, in their November meeting for approval to the next steps forward. That has moved forward rapidly. The work groups have already been, at least the one I'm involved, has already been monthly meetings set up and timed, and the work group that deals with our particular issue is being chaired by Jay. The large work group also has a steering committee, which includes Randy and John Calloway and myself and the 4 chairs of the various work groups. And the idea of that steering committee is to make sure that if there are any overlaps or intersections or complementarity in these 4 issue areas, which there are. When you talk about science priorities or funding priorities, they often have to have funding for what, so there's clearly a lot of opportunities for, I don't want to say overlap, but a lot of complementarity in terms of how these recommendations go forward on implementation, and they'll all go forward as one document, I believe, as a combined document that'll go back to DPIIC. Jay, do you have anything or Dick, anything to add from that point?
Yeah, I think most of our concerns are in this fourth work group that has members from quite a few other organizations as well as us. Both Steve and I are on that work group. That hasn't met yet, but in the charge for that, I think are two things we're interested in. The first, and probably the most important, being trying to come up with a science needs assessment, strategic science needs assessment for the Delta. I mean, we have these other work plans that are more short-term focused, but I think our letter and our charge are more strategic in nature, looking more at a 50 or 100-year horizon or 30 to 100-year horizon rather than what should we do for the next budget ask over the next 3 to 10 years. I think this committee should think seriously of, our board here should think seriously about what we can do to amplify our letter or to or follow up on our letter, really, in terms of fostering discussions on some of these topics. Dick has done a really good job of framing some of these things, but I think if we can come up with some useful speakers or panels, or maybe a little missive here and there along these lines, that would be very useful for this subcommittee of the task force from DPIIC, but also might be useful to the other committees that are subcommittees to this task force of DPIIC. And it'll be useful for our deliberations over time as well.
Yeah, we were thinking about, given that we put a lot of effort in developing the thought behind the DPIIC letter, that perhaps there's some things we can do, particularly in terms of the theoretical background for the rationale for this initiative, the science background, and that we could also move forward in parallel and maybe pursue some of that. And I've asked Dick to, you have any thoughts on that, Dick?
Okay, so I was the one that spoke of the numerous members of us up there and presented the, are we rushing down the freeway at 80 miles an hour looking 20 feet ahead? And that question, I think everybody sort of feels, yeah, we seem to be doing that. Faster environmental change probably ought to affect how we do our environmental science. But we are just at the beginning of really nailing that down. And this is where I think the job of the Independent Science Board needs to come in and explore that question, bring in other speakers, other experts who can speak to us and help us figure this out. I do know that applied ecology has gone through several phases. Into the 1970s, it was still game and fish management to maximize yields for hunters, and predators were knocked off. And the conservation biology movement took a new philosophy and used newer ecology and reformed that just maximize game approach to applied ecology. And a decade later, the restoration ecologists came on the scene and said, you know, we can repair the environment also. And that was a little irritating to the conservation biologists who are protecting nature as intact nature. But that transformation has clearly taken place. The restoration ecology is part of what we do. And I think more rapid environmental change will result in a similar transformation in how we think for at least part of the science that's being done. If you think of forest ecology, there's been tremendous transformations in how foresters are thinking about, what do we do with this biomass? It's a sink for carbon. Oops, it's a source of carbon for the atmosphere. And managing it has become all of a sudden very complex and tricky. I don't think it's going to be quite that big of a revolution for delta ecology, but we need to think through what it might be. It's what you don't expect that you need to prepare for. And so I am interested in fellow ISB members to pursue this, to help identify experts to come and speak at our meetings, to work with Liz in finding time on the schedule to set something up like this and pursue it from there.
So are you looking for suggestions of names, people to email you, or Liz, or?
On the board?
Yeah.
I have not sought other people.
Pardon?
I have not sought other people, have I?
No, but I mean, are you looking for suggestions of who we might invite in, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I'm definitely looking for suggestions from all board members as to who will, come and inform us. But I'm also looking for cohorts in the process that would be a subcommittee.
Ah, okay, good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Dick is saying we start a small subcommittee to kind of, not a subcommittee, subgroup or a covey or whatever we can call it now, to get together and try and come up with some list of names or a process forward. Maybe it's a small panel or a workshop or seminar or whatever, and get them together. So anyone want to volunteer? And
I'd volunteer for that. I was one who was at first a little skeptical, and now I've become a convert. And I think my main concern is making sure we keep this going and we don't get bogged down in process, which is so easy to happen. When I hear a working group of 30 to 40 people, I'm like, oh my God. But I do think as let's call it a cabal of the ISB. Let's get a couple of people to sort of look at this from a high level and make sure that we do keep it moving as fast as we possibly can. And I'd be willing to help out on that.
Thanks.
The DPIIC subgroups, by the way, are down to about 8, so they're manageable. Yeah. So, and John,
I'll volunteer too.
Okay.
Okay,
That sounds
so
good.
I've got
Tom
a
want to
working
join
group.
in too? So Tom.
Thank
okay.
you.
There you got a team. All right, Jessica, you had a question?
If, I'm hesitating to do this, but I know you're very interested, and I think just looking forward over the next few months, we are the Stewardship Council is working on a climate vulnerability assessment, and I think we've talked about it a little bit. I know we've been invited to come and do a presentation on where we are. And so I think over the next few months, we should really try and schedule that and come and provide an update on what we're looking at in terms of climate vulnerability for the Delta. I think it's very much related to what you were talking about, which is the system is changing really fast, and when you have a rapidly changing system, you need to both understand what the vulnerabilities are and then what it takes to be resilient and adapt to that. And it really requires a new paradigm of how you do monitoring and assessment and what you're looking for. And so as a part of the vulnerability assessment, we're really in the early stages of development. We are working closely with the Delta Science Program. They're engaged. We have some technical memorandums that we're putting together around ecosystems, disadvantaged communities, economics, water supply, and water reliability, or flooding. And we're in the very, very, very early stages of those, so I don't want to talk about them too much. But I think these conversations are going to merge at some point, whether it's through the science funding initiative work and through our vulnerability assessment and whatever investigations you have. I think there's a lot of really good examples out there of resiliency and how systems have looked at resiliency overall. Water Institute of the Gulf in New Orleans has done some really interesting work recently. I just saw a presentation by them. So point being, we are happy to help in providing other resources, providing information about what we're doing on the vulnerability assessment, and can provide resources and ideas also as well if you're interested in doing
So I
a
think
workshop.
we need to keep up with what you're doing and stay in touch and, coordinate.
Is there somebody that has the lead on that, the climate vulnerability?
On the vulnerability assessment, yes, we have a team internally, but we can set up a presentation and come and talk to you.
Okay.
So I'll work with John and Edmund and Karen, and we can find a good time on an upcoming meeting.
All right, so maybe that's one of our action items, is to follow up on that and make sure. All right, any other discussion of the DPIIC or the, our way forward?
I'm trying to think of a different venue for getting some of these ideas out. Certainly talks and panels are useful at our meetings, but I'm trying to think of something that will get out a little bit more than our internal deliberations, even though they're webcast and we have esteemed people that come here, but there's not a lot of people in the back today. I'm wondering if it would be useful for us to think about some of the folks thinking about these issues, if we could get them to write a paragraph and we could collect some of those, or some other kind of way of gathering a diverse set of ideas from a wide range of people in a pithy kind of a way that's concise, that wouldn't exceed the infiltration capacity of the audience, to get that kind of a form as well. So there's something else to consider.
Concur. So I think we should coordinate with the Delta Science Program lunches, which can bring in 40 or 50 people, which is a bigger draw than we typically have. And yes, I think we'll be, we will be finding speakers who have written papers that we can distribute beforehand. And so it's, it should be more than 25 or 50 words. We should be saying, here's a speaker that's coming with this perspective, and review the paper before the person comes.
Yeah, if I can get people to read the abstract, I'll be happy.
John?
I was just going to say, we can definitely think about that, about a brown bag series, if that would be useful.
Very good. All right, anything else on this topic? Any public comment? Okay. Are you guys taking off now, or? No, okay. Move on to John.
Great. Okay, so I want to start just with a little more detail about the proposal solicitation that Susan mentioned, that really, I think, was a major step forward for the science program and for the Stewardship Council, where close to $10 million was approved for funding, and that also importantly included funding not just from us, but from the Bureau of Reclamation, and there's an additional $7 million of funds from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife that was part of this joint solicitation that will, their awards will be announced in the next week or so. So major step. We had 62 proposals that were submitted. We were able to fund, as Susan mentioned, we funded 15 proposals. And they cover a wide range of topics. There's a number of, as you could expect, a number of proposals looking at fish issues, at flow effects on migration, food web issues, toxicities. There's one on pyrethroids, another on a mix of contaminants and temperature impacts on salmon, one on mercury issues. So lots that is of interest for the water quality. The water quality report, really relevant to the water quality report that you just put out. There's one on carbon and subsidence that was mentioned as a key part of the ecosystem amendment that builds on some of the work that's being done at Twitchell, to look at Twitchell Island that we visited yesterday, to look at those same issues in Suisun Bay. There's also one on remote sensing. And then there's a couple on human aspects. So we really tried to promote social science related research. So there's one looking at levee risk issues, and another looking at the economic benefits of wetlands through evaluating their use by recreational hunters. So there's a summary that was put together for the council that the staff put together with the brief abstracts and overviews of all of them. So I'll send that out to you. And there's also web pages that were developed for each of the projects to try to inform a broad group about the kinds of work that we're supporting. So that was definitely, has been an enormous effort by the science program and is ongoing, because now we have to put the contracts in place and work to get all that work going forward. Any questions on the solicitation? Vince?
The Fish and Wildlife proposals that will be announced, these are in addition to
Those are in addition, yes. So there's about $17 million, but jointly between all three proposals. And I should also mention, we hope this isn't a one-off effort. We plan to, we were able to put out even more money because we had $2 million of additional funding through a budget change proposal for this fiscal year that we put towards these projects, but we plan to do a proposal solicitation every other year. So next year we'll have a fellowship solicitation supported by the contract that Susan mentioned with Sea Grant, where we'll be seeking both graduate and postdoc fellows. And actually this year for the fellows we'll be supporting master students as well as PhD students for the first time. We're putting that together now, and that'll be announced before too long. And then next year, in 2 years, we hope to do another solicitation with a science-focused solicitation, likely jointly with CDFW and hopefully again with some additional Bureau funds or other funds. So we can do it on a regular basis and really start to cultivate and let people know that there's ongoing opportunities for research within the Delta.
John, are these multi-year, what is the typical duration of these projects?
Most of them are 2 to 3 years. So,
and they will be on the web page. We can have a look at the progress.
Yes.
In one web page.
Yeah, there's one web page that links to all of the individual 15 projects that we're supporting.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
And I'll send you those links.
Yeah, during this process, I know Tracy and I each read about 22 of those proposals, and they were just excellent quality. I think they're just really, really good, solid proposals. And I know it was difficult to make the final decisions, but this is a lot of good work, really. Tracy?
So thanks, John, and yeah, it was quite a process, and there were some really well-written proposals. So what we got here in our package is, this is a description of the 15 and the $9 million.
Yeah, I didn't know that was included.
Yeah, we got
great.
this, so
Okay,
it's got the abstracts for the 15 of them. But again, there was another $8 million funded by other entities, and those, it sounds like they're going to have like separate websites to see those. It's just a gentle editorial comment. This was a big deal. It's all being done contemporaneously in the Delta. It'd be nice if there was more coordination between the different streams so that we could go to one place and see everything that's been done. So just as one more thing to add to the plate. So.
Yes, we've definitely been thinking about that, and the science tracker is something that we've talked about as a way to do that, but it's still being developed.
I just want to duck in here and say congratulations. What a fabulous outcome.
Yeah, I think it was enormous effort, and we are all very happy how successful it's been, both with the number and the quality of proposals that were submitted and the selections that were made.
Good work.
Thanks. Okay, so now I want to go on then, and I have a number of other things. So mention to you that the biological goals report just recently came out. So that was an advisory panel that was requested by the State Water Resources Control Board to get input on the development of biological goals for the update to the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, to identify, not to get specific input on exact goals, but what approach should be used and what should be considered by the state board in developing the biological goals that would be a part of the evaluation of the update to the water quality control plan. So that advisory group was chaired by Cliff Dahm. Gregory Gironi was the lead author of their report. They looked at, they were asked by the board to look at 3 different issues: how to evaluate salmonid populations, how to evaluate other fish populations, and then how to look at broader ecosystem functions. And so their report looks at each of those issues. They identified for the salmonids, there's actually so much more data that they can make much more quantitative recommendations around those goals. For the other fish species, actually they were asked to look specifically at native fish. Peter Morell and Cy Simonstead focused on those issues. one of their strong recommendations was look at a broad range of fish species. Don't look just at the few target species. Look at the as broad a mix as possible. Take advantage of the broad range of monitoring that's already occurring. And they put together a summary of the fish species that are incorporated across all of the 18 ongoing monitoring efforts. So I think that you might want to look at that just for the monitoring review might be of interest. And so they highlighted, consider non-native species as well. Striped bass, even though they're non-native, have many similar needs to some of the native species and are so much more abundant that they might be a more valuable species to incorporate into the mix. And then in terms of ecosystem function, they focused primarily on productivity and food web support for fish. And I think in that case, that's where there's the least amount of information, but they made some recommendations about what kinds of issues should be considered there. And also I should mention that this was not just for the Delta, this was for the Delta and the tributaries that are a part of that, the update to the water quality control plan. And so that report is available, and I'll send you a link to the web page. It has a nice executive summary as well as it's about I think 80 to 100 page report. Any questions on that? Okay, then I also wanted to mention a few upcoming events. So on Monday next week, there's a workshop on Delta salmon rearing, salmon rearing habitat within the Delta. This is being sponsored by CAMP, the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team, and the Science Program and the Delta Conservancy have helped to support this. There's a draft report out looking at the characteristics of habitat that would be beneficial for salmon within the Delta, and as a way to really think about the opportunities for restoration for salmon habitat within the Delta, looking at things like water flow and water depth and vegetation cover, many of the things we talked about out in the field yesterday. So that is Monday. It's at our building at 989th Street and is open to the public. So if anyone is interested who's listening, I would encourage you. It starts at 9:30. It's on the second floor conference room in 989th Street. Then in terms of brown bag series, we've put together a series focusing on Bay Delta connections and really trying to think about not just Delta issues, but what are the how can we improve our understanding and our management of issues beyond just the Delta linking to the Bay and to the watershed. And so we have a 3-part brown bag series coming up, and in 3 weeks on Wednesday, May 22nd is our first brown bag series. Rich Batuk, who's retired from EPA in the Chesapeake Bay and has 3 decades of experience working on those issues in Chesapeake, and comes highly, I think you interviewed him for the monitoring review. I think he was interviewed, and comes highly recommended in terms of thinking about challenging issues on a big scale across the Chesapeake. And so he's going to come, he'll be out here for a day and a half to present a brown bag and also to interact with staff on both science and governance issues around Chesapeake Bay. So that's May 22nd at noon, again at 989th Street. The title of his talk is Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, Sharing 3 Decades of What's Worked. Following that, June 25th, Stephanie Fong from the IEP and California Department of Fish and Wildlife will talk about water quality issues more locally. And then July 18th, Jim Klern will talk about similar issues across the Bay Delta, thinking about the value of long-term monitoring. And the title of his talk is The Place of Estuaries Along the Continuum from Mountains to Oceans. So we are just putting together a flyer on those, and I think it should be done, I think it's hopefully done today or early next week, and I'll send you that flyer so you could put those dates on your calendar. And then farther off, there is an upcoming workshop. The Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team, or the DISC team, is putting on a symposium in August on invasive species issues, so certainly that will be of interest for the invasive species working group. And that is Thursday, August 29th. It's an all-day event at UC Davis. It's just being put together now. The focus is going to be on the use of remote sensing to map and understand invasives, mostly plants, but also probably trying to think about how you might use remote sensing tools to look at invasives in general. And then the last two items to update you on, I wanted to let you know that we are moving forward with recruitment for the process for recruitment for ISB members. So many of you have given me suggestions. If you have additional suggestions, please send those anytime. We're putting together an announcement that probably will go out in the next couple weeks to announce the open positions and to really cast a broad net to recruit, that given the big turnover that we'll be facing. And so any questions on any of those events or issues? So then lastly, I just wanted to mention the article that I presented to the council last week, and that is a biological compromise, the high methane cost of sequestering carbon in restored wetlands. It focuses on carbon sequestration issues at Twitchell Island, right, our last stop on the trip yesterday. Their field sites were at Twitchell Island and Sherman Island. They used gas flux towers to look at carbon accumulation, removal of carbon from of CO2 from the atmosphere and sequestration into the soil in those managed freshwater wetlands. And then they also looked at fluxes of methane, loss of methane from those wetlands that has counteractive effects in terms of greenhouse gases. What they found was those managed wetlands are sequestering carbon in the soil at an incredibly high rate, even higher than most tidal freshwater wetlands, because of the way they're managing the water to promote productivity and to reduce less of a source than existing agricultural uses. So in that sense, they actually do have a positive effect compared to existing uses if we convert those areas to restored or managed wetlands. And then they also highlight the many other benefits, primarily the subsidence reversal that's occurring with all that organic matter being accumulated. So I'll send you those two papers if you're interested. Yes, Liz.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I followed quite everything that you covered, but I think it's important when we talk about carbon sequestration that we pay attention to the time frame. So short-term sequestration doesn't necessarily mean long-term sequestration, which is what ultimately we're looking for. So if I understood your summary of the paper, over short time periods, the sequestration was more rapid than other land uses. But it also sounded like there were a lot of carbon losses to methane. And so on balance, were they still effective?
On balance, compared to the ag fields, they were definitely significantly effective.
Okay.
If you only look at the net effect of carbon going into the ground and methane being lost, they were net emitters.
Okay, yeah.
And it is, but I agree completely that short-term versus long-term issues, and this is definitely looking at it in a short time frame, and then, factoring in, it depends also what conversion factor you use for methane.
Right.
as a part of that, and they discuss some of those issues.
Yeah, I think it's just something for us to pay attention to. I mean, things can change a lot, they can even sort of move between sequesters and emitters over short time periods before they sort of settle on a permanent role.
Yeah, I agree completely. Thank you for adding that. Okay, that's all my.
Okay, thanks, John. Any other questions? Tracy, do you still have something? Or any public comment? Okay, we'll move on to item number 6, which is the election of the new chair. And as I think all of you know, our chair terms are 2 years. And the way we operate is we have a chair-elect, the chair, and the past chair is sort of a 3-person team that kind of keeps things rolling. My term officially expires on May 31st, and Liz takes over on June 1st. But given that her term expires on August 31st, she will be chair from June 1st till August 31st, 2020. So we need to then now elect a chair who will then take over on that September 1st time period. So I would like to nominate Jay to be that chair, and one of the rationales that I think it's important that we have a chair, for one, and secondly that chair-elect, but we have a chair after September 1st, but we have a chair-elect, and also that, we'll need to have some strong sort of continuance of our activities with this large turnover, and I think Jay is, not only is he local, but he knows more about the Delta itself than most of us do, I think, and so I would like to nominate Jay as our next chair. So I need a second.
Is there any other nomination?
Well, first I need a second.
Enthusiastically seconded.
First I get a second, and then is there any other nominations?
Well, I nominate Steve. No, I'm kidding. I had a question, so I just want to question a process. So Liz's term will end on August 31st, 2020, and whoever is the lucky person that's selected as the next chair-elect, they would then begin a 2-year term?
That's what we're proposing now, and what would have to happen is we'd need to have a change in our guidelines to reflect that the new chairs will now, instead of starting on June 1st,
start on September 1st.
Which makes sense, because that's when the whole bunch of people are starting.
And then you, as the past chair, would then get a truncated term. You would only have to...
No, I would remain past chair, because Liz would not be a past chair. So...
Well, so
I would remain past chair through Jay's next term.
Okay, well, now I'm confused, but I vote in favor.
What's that?
I'm confused, but I vote in favor.
Jay will take over as chair. He would start chair-elect on June 1st. On September 1st of 2020, he would take over as chair for 2 years. I would be, of course, past chair starting the June 1st. And then in September of 2020, I would remain past chair because I would be the only past chair who's carrying over.
So you would get a 3-year and 3-month past chair sentence. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then shortly after sometime after the new folks arrive, when they have a chance to get settled, then they would need to elect a chair-elect.
I don't know that if I became... Another way to view this, however, would be if I were, as chair-elect, I would finish out Liz's term as chair. And in that time, we could have a new election and other things could happen.
You can step down at any time.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I'm completely comfortable with the idea of starting a 2-year term at the beginning of all these new people coming in. I think we should view that as maybe for a year while everybody settles in, and after a year, people can decide what they want to do. Doesn't have to be me. You won't be here, but the few people here will be here. But I think it's also I don't want to have things locked in for 2 full years with a whole new
Yeah,
crew of
and
folks
after
coming in, so.
talking to the lawyers about all of this, or at least hearing their words, you as chair can step down at any time.
Right, right.
And then whoever the chair-elect can take over at
Right.
that stage. So if 9 months or a year down the road, you want to take my place as past chair, you can do that by stepping down.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I could step down from a lot of things.
You get Liz?
Yeah, so I think this is an excellent proposal because it gives us the opportunity to have continuity during a time of a lot of transition on the board. And I also think it'll be helpful for new board members to benefit from the, not only the continuity, but the perspectives that you would bring from long-term service and leadership on the board. So I support Jay's nomination.
Okay, seeing no other discussion, Edmund, how do we vote? Oh, is there any public comment on this topic? And then what's that? We have to have a roll call vote? Okay, I'll just say yes for, well, whatever. I'll start with Joe?
Yes.
Tracy? Aye. John?
Yay.
Jay?
Abstain? No, yes.
Steve, yes.
Liz, yes.
Dick? Yes for Vince. Tom?
Aye.
Joy?
Yes?
Okay, unanimous, sort of.
See what happens if you stay in the room?
Okay, I think that covers that, and then on, we're scheduled now for a break. Do folks want to take a break, or?
Suggest yes, we do, because we may have a protracted discussion.
All right, so let's take our, we have
5 minutes or so.
Yeah, let's take a 10-minute break and be back at about 10:15 sharp, or 10:10 sharp. That sounds good. Yeah, well, if I say 10, if we're back at 10:10, that's what we're scheduled. Thank you.
Here's a picture of that tidal bore.
All right, we'll reconvene our meeting and with item number 7 on the agenda, which is a discussion and update on our current reviews, and we'll start out with IEP. Vince.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. You all have a copy of this review, and I really want to thank Liz and Dick and Tracy for, incredible amount of work. As you can see, it's quite an extensive review on covering a variety of different topics as well. I want to start off by emphasizing this was not typical of our reviews. This is not of an area where all of us have a certain expertise. It was looking at the way a program operates, and we relied on perceptions of others. We relied on analysis of our own, our experiences, to try to put together something that would be useful. And of course, as you know, IEP is undergoing a lot of changes, both internal and external. So this was a very, very timely review. If you also notice, the title has changed, that we're now talking about the IEP's ability to provide science supporting management in the Delta. Now, although that was always our emphasis, we thought we should put that right in the title as opposed to simply emphasizing that it was a review of the program. So again, to go over how we did this, and I want to go over then some of the comments that we made and how we addressed them. First of all, we were very interested in finding the perceptions of others about IEP. We sent out and received 111 questionnaires back, which provided the basis for the graphs that we used. These included over 400 written comments, some very, very detailed and quite lengthy, and over 25 detailed interviews that we had. Now, most of the members participated in at least one of these reviews, where you saw the type of questions we were asking and the type of information that we were trying to gather from this. Now, on top of the perceptions that we got, we had our own analysis, which involved reviewing documents, past reviews of IEP, our own experiences with the agency, weighing perceptions of others against our own experience, attending meetings of the directors. We did a lot of things that we ended up using in coming up with our recommendations. So if you look at the report, of course, we opened up with what we think are the most important part, the recommendations. One of you recommended that we prioritize the recommendations in terms of what could be done. Well, we did that in a certain extent, but we were more concerned about having a logical sequence of the recommendations where one led to the other, as opposed to just going on a strict, do this in specific order. So the review of other programs, now it turns out that this is very similar to what was done by by ESSA for the MER review, and that they chose some of the same programs that we were reviewing. They have a different purpose in their review, where we were looking more at structures and success stories and things like that, and pulling out reasons why a program was successful, which of course is one of the things that the ESSA is doing with the MER review. And then of course then we have details about the questionnaire and the results. So, okay, the major points raised. Now, I mentioned about the recommendations, about the sequence of those that I think we have in a very logical and easy to follow, and they really are still reflecting priorities. One of the comments that we received was to make the recommendations more positive, and we have looked at this, but we've decided that, of course, we want to do this in the framework of what our recommendations and conclusions are. There were some points that we raised that there really was very difficult to put in a positive review because there was very, very strong concerns about them. So we did this as much as possible. The other thing, again, this is not a typical review. We're looking at what we're finding based on incredible detailed analysis of, months of our lives spent, interviewing and working on this text. So it wasn't like, all of us would have an opinion on restoration. So we really had to weigh that, and we did look at all the comments that we received and the several opportunities you've had to review this. And I think these recommendations do represent what a lot of our feelings are. There may be wording that we want, but we've gone back and forth with these for so long. The second was a clarification of what were our findings and opinions compared to the perceptions that others had. And we have tried to make this very clear in the text, how we came about this and how we balance these in terms of the issues. There was also an issue of, can we provide budget and personnel questions? And we talked about this at the last IEP meeting. And, initially, we understood that, yes, this information was available. It could be provided to us. As we dug deeper, as some of the IEP personnel the newer personnel had more experience with the program, they realized that a lot of this information just isn't available. It's just it's cobbled together, so that a lot of the figures that are given about the size of the monitoring, it's not IEP as much as it's a mixture of different agencies, of SWFCA, and a variety of other things. So some of these questions, while they were important if we were doing, say, a review of the fiscal aspects of the agency, would be critical, we didn't feel that it was important. And in fact, we pushed it as far as we could in terms of getting the information available. We spoke extensively with Steve Culberson, especially in the beginning, more recently with Stephanie Fong, and then, just by attending the directors' meetings and the hallway conversations, we found quite a bit of stuff that was not readily apparent to us, and again, was information that we were able to incorporate into the review. So I really am very pleased that we finally got this document to you. I think it's going to be very useful. As I think all of you know, we had agreed at a board meeting that we would give the IEP a couple of days' notice before it was actually released to the public. So they did get to see this, and from what I understand, has been circulated to everybody associated with IEP, so that essentially this document is being viewed by them as certainly a working draft that we are behind. So with that, and I've talked to Steve about various ways we can continue, but I'd like to kind of open it up first of all to Tracy, Liz, and Dick, if you have any comments that you want to add, and anything more than that I've said, to try to put this in the context of where we are with this review and how we came there. Pass.
So I agree with everything you said, Vince. The one thing that I would like to say is that, ultimately this is a review of the entire board. And so even though the work team has done a lot of the legwork and put together this draft review, that we welcome the feedback and suggestions of the full board. And I guess one thing I would encourage you to do is to look at the appendices and sort of the information that we gathered that led us to our recommendations. But I just want to emphasize the fact that this is a product of the board, and we want to make sure that the full board has opportunity to give feedback.
And again, to clarify what I was saying, the fact that this was such a different review than the ones that were in the past, that we weren't just depending on literature and perceptions, that we've really tried to be both accurate and in consensus about what these recommendations were. And we did go back and forth a lot of times, because, very often we just had different opinions, but I think we really did reach a consensus among the working group. Sorry, Edmund.
Yeah, one is just a suggestion on the document itself, and then I'll ask a question. The suggestion is, from what I understand, the key findings that you have, I think, are meant to relate to the specific recommendations.
Right.
It might help, the recommendations are numbered, the key findings are lettered, so it's, and it also might be helpful to repeat those recommendations within the key findings, because otherwise you're trying to page back and forth and figure out which is where.
Yeah. Just to quickly answer your questions, in the previous version that you saw, we in fact did that. We had related the findings to the recommendations, and the feeling was, because so many of the findings cut across recommendations, and that it was better to do it as a synthesis document. But if one of you want to add more on that, but we had done that, and the feeling was that this was detracting, because it really related more to multiple things than actually to an individual recommendation.
Yeah, I understand that, but it's, okay, well then somewhere I'm back to being confused, because the, B is the mission, number 2 talks specifically about the mission and the recommendations, and C is organizational structure, number 3 is the organizational structure. So they do seem to relate tightly, but there may be more broader things. So I'm just, somewhere.
Do you have, if you have specific suggestions of how we can do that?
I can give you written.
Yeah, because that would be, I think useful for us to evaluate how to do that.
Great. The question I had is there anything?
Wait, Tracy, did you want to comment on that?
Right now, they are close, but they don't track one-to-one. So, and we did get comments from the board when we gave out for individual comments saying, do it a little differently. Don't try to make them all match up.
Okay.
So now we're hearing make them all match up. So I think it's about time to punt to another working group. So anyway.
No, I totally recognize that dilemma in other reviews. The question is there anything that came up and that you heard from any board members that were contradictory? Are there any issues that we need to discuss as a?
You mean besides Jay's edits that were contradictory?
Jay always contradicts himself in his own edits.
I just want to make sure all points of view are heard.
Plus others, yeah.
A little schizophrenic in terms of it's your own views, so.
But is there anything that came up that you think on the recommendations that there were some?
Well, I think the
worth
three
discussing?
things that I mentioned were the big ones. I've talked to Tom, who originally had brought up the idea about the more positive aspect in terms of that we have pushed it as far as I think we can. Again, but you'll have a chance to comment if you want to make additional edits on those. The structure of the report has been all over the place in terms of recommendations. You just brought up the one about, one-to-one, and I think even in the penultimate version, we had the recommendation, then findings right underneath that. Then in the next version, we had, the recommendations, and then findings lumped with different recommendations. And then in this third iteration, we decided that because they were so cross-cutting, that we should do them this way, as Tracy just alluded.
Yeah, because the way I think about it, and we all think about it differently, is that, get the recommendation number X and say, wait a minute, how did they ever come to that conclusion? And therefore, the only way I can figure that out is to read the whole document. And maybe that's the intent, but.
Yeah. I'm repeating myself, but the fact is that the recommendations were based on multiple findings that we ended up putting together. But we'll certainly appreciate your suggestions.
Jay.
I think that the work is really good and certainly a tremendous, exhausting and exhaustive discussion and gathering of information and perspectives from a lot of people. There comes a time, I think, in any review, it's just sort of like any dissertation where you just have to say it's done. Where there's nothing worse than an overripe report or an overripe dissertation. So I think we're getting to closure here pretty quick. In looking it over, my only grumble is the recommendations are nice, they're positive, they're useful, but they're sort of incremental. They're sort of retrospective. And this comes off of our letter, perhaps, working too much on our letter to DPIIC. Can we add a paragraph or two on the long-term future of IEP? Just really look farther forwards. We've really looked in retrospective. We've heard what people have to say about the program now and how it's evolved. Where do we think it ought to go in 20 years?
Yeah.
Just a couple of paragraphs.
Yeah. Jay, we really would appreciate if you'd kind of give us a start on that, and I'll tell you why this is. One of the directors of IEP cornered me at the workshop and said, what are you guys doing? I mean, the MER and the IEP reviews and DPIIC, they're all going in the same direction. And I said, yeah, this is good. This is what we're hoping will happen.
Right.
So one of the problems, of course, is there's so many issues that are external to IEP that affect the future.
Sure.
Sure. We put some in, we've taken some of them out. But if you would give us a start on something that we could look at fresh, and then we could work on it ourselves, that would be
one of my concerns with this review, and I think any review of IEP, is there's so much going on within IEP, it's easy to get lost within IEP.
Yeah.
But the purpose of IEP is not IEP. The purpose of IEP is to provide this longer-term perspective and the science management kind of perspective. And any review of IEP is always going to spend a lot of time on IEP, but I think we ought to think about what does this mean for 20 years from now, for where this organization ought to go, and how it ought to fit within the constellation of other activities.
Yeah, well, if you could kind of give us a starting point to look at, that would be great, and then we'll be thinking about it the whole time when we wait to hear from you.
You could also, develop some of your own.
Well, yeah,
thoughts.
But again, at this point, we're so close to this.
Yeah.
I think, and we've been concentrating on the issues that IEP is facing in terms of whether we agree or
Sure, I
disagree
understand.
with the stand they're taking. And so, you know, that we certainly have opinions on that are forward-looking.
Right.
But these are like forward-looking within a year or 2-year
Right.
time frame that they've got to deal with. So yeah, anything you would give us as a starting point would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Joe?
So it's a pretty thorough document. You have done quite a bit of work, and congratulations. I have a question now. This is kind of a non-standard type review. How much your perceptions, the committees and the questionnaire, their perceptions differed? Is it an overlap? There was quite a bit of overlap, or it differed?
Yeah, we made a point of keeping the questionnaire and their comments as really separate units. That's why we've put that the figures and then a detailed appendix. If I had to give a answer comparatively, the questionnaires were much more negative than we were. And that's why when we've circulated the draft that's gotten to the IEP directors, one of the comments we got is that, you know, and it was again from we didn't realize there was that much concern out there as we've seen from those comments. So I think, and again, we wanted to keep our perceptions, or their perceptions and ours, we wanted to use them as informative, but we did not want the report based just on their perceptions. That would have been easy. We could have given it to you 6 months ago.
But also, I would say that the perceptions that we heard from the interviews and the questionnaires, and just all the information we gathered, the perceptions that we heard were the universe of perceptions. It was a universe of perceptions.
Yeah.
It was everything positive and everything negative.
Yeah.
Some were highly, highly positive and some were highly, highly negative, and a lot were in the middle. So there was a whole universe of perceptions out there. And so the recommendations and the findings that we have in the report are what we have come up with, what we've taken from that universe of perceptions.
Yeah. And in the appendix of they are quotes. We did not edit them at all. We did not, you know, if you look, we tried to give both sides, representative quotes of both sides.
Joy, do you have any questions?
Mainly, I was wondering how they chose those quotes in the appendix.
Well, this is something I did based on, I was trying to balance, so I would have an opening statement saying that, you know, people feel strong that the current IEP organization works, however, there are other opinions. We have all 400 quotes that we can put out. I think as one of the first meetings where we talked about using quotes, I think it was John that pointed out saying, you know, people read the first few quotes and, you know, you can't put all 400 of them in. You've got to be selective and you've got to organize them in some way. So we organized them first by questions and then tried to give the range of opinions.
Okay, John?
Yeah, that would be a nice statement to put in there that they represent the range of opinions.
Thanks, Joy.
John?
One of the things that came up when we did the adaptive management report, people were asking us, what actions are you recommending? Who should take those actions? And I haven't delved into the guts of this enough to know how much you're getting into that, but it may be taking it a step too far. We felt it was pushing things a little too far when we got that response to the draft of the adaptive management. We did make some specific suggestions about what should be done and who should do it, but not for all the recommendations. What's your thinking on that? Is that taking things too far, or is there an opportunity here to push things a little bit harder?
Yeah, I think the tenor of the recommendations, the justification behind the findings and the comments clearly indicate that it's the directors that have to take the lead, that they are they're the ones that are being blamed for a lot of the problems. And so I think even without saying the directors are the first ones that have to be involved in doing this, it comes across clearly in the report. When I say the directors, I don't mean the lead scientists. I mean the directors of the different agencies that actually, meet about budgets and everything else, about the transparency issues. All these things actually go back to the directors.
Do you think it's worth pointing that out in a very blunt, explicit statement?
I think we are pretty direct in that recommendation that a lot of the starting place of working towards solution resides with the leadership and the directors of IEP. If others want to suggest language, we would consider it, but internally in the working group, we went back and forth with a lot of versions to sort of evolve to the place where we are, which I think was definitely a compromise within the working group. But yeah, I don't know. Did you not feel that that our recommendations toward the directors, you didn't feel that it was direct enough?
Well, I didn't feel anything because I just got this 2 days ago to look at it.
But John, if you do get a chance to look at it more and see a place that we could put a statement like that in, that would be great. I talked to some of the directors that had seen this, and with the exception of the criticisms of the directors, they felt that we were right on with the other points that we were making, and that's not ununderstandable that they would take some exception with personal criticism. But any suggestions you could offer would be great on that. Anybody else? Sorry, my back is to you.
I had an opportunity to look at it fairly carefully, and the one place where I really struggled with issues was with your recommendations 7 and 8. And it seems like there's two separate issues there. There's one, just data availability. And then there's sort of the documentation or selling the value of the data. And those two recommendations sort of blend those together. The first one is a little more on the data availability, but then the second one comes back to data availability. And it just seemed to me this is a place where the directors could actually do something. And if that were clear, I think that would help them.
And that was why we added the phrase in from directors on down, that this is multiple. Mm-hmm. To me, they're linked, is I think what you're saying.
They are linked, but they're separate problems.
Yes. Okay, that's one of the things we can talk about. Dick, what did you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to the issue of the directors, because it's very hard to say it's the directors, because the directors are directors of agencies. They're responsible to constituencies. Constituencies can be in disagreement, and we've had some political changes, and so I tended to push towards the wording of there is disagreement, there is not cohesion in the organization, but that goes all the way back to the interested parties. And partly it is the directors who don't seem to be keeping the interested parties in line, informed, or they're not responding to them appropriately. But it's a pretty systemic problem. And so...
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And as Liz pointed out, we went back and forth trying to word this in such a way that we were getting a consensus because there was a range of opinions, oftentimes based on who we talked to and based on, I have to admit, having gone to a director's meeting was, as you have, is when you really get the sense of conflict.
So I just want to just sort of remind us all, again, you've started off with this, Vince, this was a very different review than we've done as the board before. And we've been asked to do this review for almost the entire time that this board has been in existence. There's been pressure for us to do a review of IEP because there's been this tension about IEP and whether or not resources are being used for what they should be used for. Are some people paying too much, others aren't paying enough, and is there enough introspection of this program? So I think we've done a really good job of laying out the range of opinions about IEP. We've gotten a fair amount of factual information to back up some of the issues that we highlight here. This is going to be a little different. Like the water quality review, the council then wanted us to work with the Delta Science program to figure out how can we move towards implementing some of the recommendations. At this point, we've made recommendations that are speaking to a lot of different constituencies, both within and outside the IEP. I'm pretty sure this is going to be taken then by the IEP and their stakeholders, and it's not going to be up to us. I think we've done our job of highlighting things coming from the ISB. IEP is going to have to figure out what they want to do with this, or if they don't want to do anything with it, then others in the region are going to say we need to examine what IEP is doing in light of these recommendations. I think we, at this point, we should make this a good report, be as objective as we can, put it out there, and then I think my view is it's our role to step back at that point and not be too involved in the inner machinations of how that's addressed. The other thing is that with the monitoring enterprise review, and we point out in here, there will be some recommendations coming out of that about the perceptions of overlap and redundancy of data, things we've talked about on Tuesday and Wednesday this week with ESSA. People are going to look to that as well. So I wouldn't get too wrapped up in how our recommendations, let's make them correct and objective, but I really think there's another community that's going to take this and work with it, and it's not going to be us per se.
Yeah, thank you. Very articulate. That's really one of the points I was trying to make. I think there's two things that come out from this, one of which is this review is going to help our review of the monitoring enterprise review. Having done this first, I think it was really propitious in terms of doing a better job on that. And I suspect that had we not done this, one of the first things we'd be doing in the MER is looking at this. So I think personally, the time now is to get comments on this from the people, the public, the stakeholders on our report, that's going to be the best way in terms of giving us ideas about how to proceed. So that would be my idea. But again, I think this is going to help the monitoring enterprise review tremendously, having done this first. And as you mentioned, we've been pressured from the beginning to do this, and I'm glad we finally said, okay, we'll do it.
Dick, do you have? So it sounds like now the report was released to the public, but we haven't officially asked for public comments on it. So it seems like at some stage we need to get to that stage, and it seems that that some of the board members want a little more time to read it, and some want to provide you with some edits or comments. So I guess I would recommend that you'd set up a time limit for those, and then go ahead and revise it based on what you receive. And at that stage, we could go out for, it could be posted for a full, whatever days we need for a public comment. And then we'll have time to have one more discussion on incorporating those comments or whatever in the final draft.
Right. I think, though, we should put it out for public comment after that period, not review it again as a whole board.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying if you say 2 weeks, get your comments.
2 weeks is perfect.
And then whatever long it's going to take you to incorporate those, and then they can go immediately to a posting to public.
I think that would be the ideal way to proceed.
So we can release it for public comment in June.
or as soon as they can, yeah.
Right, so I mean, it's posted right now, so we will probably start receiving some public comment, but we still should have
Right, 30-day period.
a round of comments, and I think the comments from the individual board members are then public as well. We'll make a revision, and then we'll post it for public comment for probably a 30-day or whatever period.
What I'm suggesting is we can individually send comments, the edits we talked about, the paragraph, and then the work group would incorporate
Right.
those as they see fit, and then that document would go for the
Public
30-day
comment.
full public comment.
Right,
At the
right.
same time, it comes back to us to
Okay?
think
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
That make sense?
Yep.
Yep.
So 2 weeks?
2 weeks would be perfect.
Okay, so maybe make sure we get a reminder on that, Edmund, on the 2-week thing.
And I also want to point out that Edmund and Kat were absolutely indispensable in terms of the stuff they did. And Karen provided comments on the last draft as well, so we want to add our thanks to them as well.
And so I would, again, thinking how this board usually works, let's make comments due to us by Monday, open of business Monday, May 20th. It gives you one more weekend to work on it.
Okay. So thank you. That's great.
Okay, Vince, you're on for the monitoring enterprise review.
I used my opening statement about how valuable the IP review is going to be for the monitoring enterprise review, but I think that's really going to be something that we're going to be very, very glad we have when we are referring back, because the IP does such a large portion of the monitoring. So we received a draft copy of Report 1 from ESSA, and we've not received a lot of comments, but the comments we have received have been fairly positive about it. And I think that's when the working group met on Wednesday. We talked about it a little. We didn't have time in that full-day session that we had till 2 o'clock, and then we met separately after that to actually go over the comments in detail. But I think the general impression is that we're quite pleased with the report that they provided, and we will get comments back to them. Tuesday, we had an all-day workshop, which was attended by 52 people. And just to give you kind of an overview with not going into too much details, the project director for ESSA gave an overview of the whole project in terms of the tasks, the deliverables, the review questions, the metadata analysis that they're going to do. And then they really went into detail. I mean, I thought they were very good at facilitating these type workshops in terms of how they did it. They had a variety of interactive things where we put dots on different things, and which they're actually going to now follow up with an anonymous survey because of the social tendency. If there's a lot of dots in one, people want to add a dot to that. So they're going to follow this up with a Delphi analysis that they're going to do. They supplied us with a great lunch. I mean, one of the best I've ever had at a workshop like this. Perhaps Davis could learn something about these lunches, Jay. No, it was very good, the lunch. Okay. Then we had 2 focal groups. He's going to make a comment back, or. The 2 focal groups that we had were very, very good. The first one was for an hour and a half, where they divided people up in terms of their research, not their research, their interests, whether it be habitat or water quality or floods or flow characteristics. And then we switched groups and did it for an hour the second time. They tried to do a wrap-up. It was the end of the day, and people were pretty burned out, so that wasn't super successful. Although only about 20 people left by the end of the day, which I thought was really good. Normally they have quite a few that are bowing out after lunch and things like that. So that was really quite successful. But what I thought was really good was that when we met with ESSA on Wednesday, the working group met, and there were issues that came up that I think we got some type of resolution that were also in the report, but that came out of what ESSA was going to do next, and also what we were going to do as a board for Component 2. Now, the first of these was, looking at how are we going to organize, or how are they going to organize the management needs in terms of evaluating the monitoring program. And the idea that came up with, this is from Steve, was let's follow the Delta plan in terms of doing this. Look at what the needs that are identified with that, and we'll use that as the basis in terms of starting off. And that was a very, very good suggestion. What was less agreement on, and is still not quite resolved, is what platform they should be using for this large inventory tool. Now, there's two points of view, one of which is that the inventory tool is really for us to use in our second component, but that, it's not something that's to be glitzy, that's ready to be used by the public. And the second one is we want to make it available that the science program can maintain it. And the problem is the platform. They want to use something called Django. And George Isaac was there, and he was really good in terms of explaining all of this, versus two other platforms that they don't feel as confident in. Problem is, and I'm going to ask then Edmund to explain this, one of the platforms they don't want to use is the platform that's used by the state. Now, George has indicated there is some type of balance or intermediate stage that can be used. And Edmund actually went back, talked to Karen and some of the other people at the Stewardship Council about what they felt, because one of our impressions was that really this is something that we need input from the science program about how to do this. And since I didn't understand a lot of, especially when they said what's under the hood of these different programs, there was actually no term that I even had any idea what it meant. So Edmund, could you kind of summarize the...
Yes. So pretty much in terms of the tool options, it comes down to a few things, time and budget. So pretty much the programming language that ESSA is proposing and recommending, Django, has a lot of the built-in functions that are needed for the inventory tool for the analysis for Component 1, versus the state's preference of using CCAN and Drupal has less built-in functions and would require a little more programming and work. So in order to meet, based on the budget that we have available and based on the timeline that we have, it would result in a lot less features for the tool. So our general preference is to go with ESSA's recommendations of Django in hopes of getting more functionality for the tool. But we're still working on it internally within the Delta Stewardship Council, and we'll be getting back to ESSA about our preference. So pretty much we're just limited by the time and budget.
Jay?
This is the common reaction of any project that is asked to comply with a standard. Oh, but we could do so much better if we deviate from the standard. But there's, is there a way that in doing this work in a non-standard format that it can be made compatible with the state's standard format?
Yeah. Well, George was very helpful in this, in that he said that the science tracker can support the Django platform. It will be more difficult to enter new data in. I'm going to let everybody see if I've got this right. More difficult to enter new data in. They gave us a choice of platforms, but the one they didn't give us in the proposal, remember the proposal becomes the contract, was not the one that the state uses.
My understanding was that the data entry would be one of the functionalities we would get, and it could operate under either system, but if you wanted to add new functionality to the inventory, that would require separate programming.
I just think that when we do software stuff, data stuff, we should do it in a way assuming that in 5 years all the software is gone, and that we have preserved the data in a way that whatever the new latest and greatest Django N+1 is it can be sucked up and adapted to quickly. And so I think that's probably the most important thing, rather than what we do it in it now, make sure that the data that's produced will be compatible with the state's standard, so that it can be taken and upgraded to, because within a very short time, all these things become obsolete, and you're stranded with lost stuff if you're not careful this way.
Edmund, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so in terms of compatibility, comparability, it just means it'll be more work on the other end versus for ESSA, because the key thing is the inventory tool would have the metadata, and then the metadata that's used for the analysis of your report should remain static, so you shouldn't be updating because you want to see what was available at the time. But the idea of the science tracker or the future of this monitoring inventory tool, there's quite a bit of alignment, because a lot of the information that ESSA is compiling, the metadata, could be information that the science tracker wants. So in terms of like exporting the metadata, from my understanding, it's all structured query language. You'll have that metadata available to upload to a new tool. But that tool is really mainly for the analysis of component 1 and component 2. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
This is not for this group to decide. We have no expertise, no insights in this. My only fear is that we will need this. The science program really should do this. Make sure that there's a longer-term trajectory for these data and the program, because I understand all too well how every consultant has their favorite software, right, and they will give you very good explanations why the software they know best is the only one you should consider. And for their local work, that they're probably right. But we have a longer-term strategic interest in this, I think. Yeah. And we have an interest in not being always beholden to a particular contractor and a particular software. That's just a rabbit hole for us.
I think the idea is that if the science tracker does take off, there is the monitoring tool could evolve into science tracker or just be a part of the science tracker. So.
Yeah, we definitely are trying. I mean, I think given how much data will be collected for this, we're definitely thinking about the compatibility issues, and this will become a huge pulse of information that will be useful into the science tracker, or whatever broader tool that we're developing.
An expedited path to confluence is what I'm looking for here.
Yeah, and Jay, we were very lucky in that George Isaac came to both the full-day workshop, was talking to people there, and then came to our whole meeting too. So I think at the end he's satisfied that it can work, but we're following up this weekend for some more details to make sure, because I agree this is the biggest, most important thing in terms of having this. And I know Liz, I've talked to her, she feels that having it available for future use by others is critical. Actually, we've been telling people that we're going to make it available for future use. So it is one of our priorities. Anybody want to add anything, John, about what's under the hood?
No, I don't look under hoods. I agree with Jay that the bottom line is making sure that going forward you're not going to lose data, but you're going to be able to use data to the maximum extent. And the systems will change. One of the things we discussed in our interactions earlier this week that we didn't really resolve and perhaps can't be resolved, we identified two potential arenas of use of this. One is our own use in terms of preparing the review, and the other is sort of the long-term use, people picking it up and running with it and twisting and turning the data in various ways. The public use, we were referring to it, of the tool. But we haven't really defined what this public is. Is it use by the Delta Science Program? Is it use by the community of scientists who work in the Delta? Is it used by a broad spectrum of interest groups? Do we run into questions of data propriety in opening it up that way that we haven't really considered. I don't know that we can resolve that at this point, but I think it's a factor that lurks in the background of whatever selection we make, that we don't want to foreclose future options necessarily by the choice of particular methodologies or tools.
Yeah, thank you, John. One of the things that Campbell Ingram brought up was that when people come to him with proposals and contracts, having a search of all the potential monitoring programs that are done would be something that he's going to insist on, and of course that would require having our tool being usable. So there's a lot of, really a lot of positive interest in this. One of the things that they did was this thing called Mentimeter, which is like, you clickers where you vote on something at the beginning. And there was really very strong optimism that this review is going to be positive and do something. So I thought that was really very, very helpful. I'd like to just mention the third issue that we resolved that second day. And this is something that I think ESSA really hadn't thought about how to do it, and they were just kind of coming to us with a blank slate. And they have a consultant that's going to do the socioeconomic analysis, but he was mainly talking about stuff that he can't do. And so John came up with a very good direction to push them in, is let's look at stressors that affect the delta, and then let's look at how the delta affects these stressors in terms of having a binary way of looking at the monitoring programs that are out there. And John, if you want to expand on that.
No, I've forgotten what I said.
Yeah. It was very good when you said it. So, and hopefully they took notes. No, they did. And it was an example, like, they talked about conversion that's being very common in the Delta, where you take agricultural land and you convert it to mansions so that people have this, and what that would do in terms of influencing water. Or you have toxic algae, what that would do in terms of influencing housing prices. So that's, two of the examples that we used.
Well, I think the point I was making was that looking at socioeconomic monitoring data is just opening up a huge arena of potential variables and twists and turns that you can get into. And what we really need to focus on is those things that have a social dimension that are affected by management decisions within the Delta and by the monitoring that it informs adaptive management in the Delta. So we filter socioeconomic variables in terms of how they relate to Delta management directly, not necessarily how Delta management is going to influence standard of living and things like that.
Okay, does anybody else from the working group have anything they want to add based on either the workshop or the discussion? I just to say the workshop I thought went really well, and there was a lot of interest in it. Steve?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said about the workshop. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm there, and a lot of the work groups in many respects talked about what the science needs were for the particular topic, of which part of those could be answered by monitoring, but other stuff required additional science. And there was one on invasive species, which was interesting because it relates to what we're about to review. Did you want to say anything about the component two? Because we had discussed about now moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. That was my next point. Yeah. So the component two, remember, this is what we are going to do in terms of the analysis of the meta attributes and all of that that's being done. But we decided there were some things we could implement immediately. John is summarizing some questions that we're going to organize our thinking about. Tracy is going to take ideas that the rest of the working group is pulling out of the draft report number 1 that we got from ESSA in terms of compiling this and sort of giving us directions that we want to go and things that we can do while in fact we're waiting for the inventory tool is what they're referring to it to be available. Anything else you want to?
Didn't we have some writing assignments and?
Yeah, these are the writing assignments that we have, yeah, that Tracy and John are coordinating these.
I thought all the writing assignments went to Vince and to Steve, but anyway. The one thing I would say is I think we had a good discussion with ESSA on Wednesday about delineating what they were going to do and what we were going to do in Component 2, because it wasn't, my perspective was it wasn't clear. They were thinking that maybe they had more responsibility to determine the direction of Component 2, and I think they were relieved. We convinced them to sort of back off on that and let that be our call. Once we see the inventory tool, we need to decide what are the needs that when we're reviewing monitoring and whether it's sufficient for science and adaptive management in the Delta, we need to be the ones framing up what the important drivers are of that monitoring, because I think they were looking to do that themselves. And they were, in my view, they were going to constrain their analysis because they felt they couldn't deal with the whole universe of needs of monitoring. And I think it was pretty clear to me, we reached an agreement that we will be the ones that decide what the bounds are on those management needs, and not ESSA.
Yeah, that's a very important point, that we want them to put the emphasis on synthesis. They have something they're talking about called contextual mapping, which we've discussed on conference calls with them, and I'm still not sure what exactly that is in terms of their synthesis. If any of you understand what they meant by that, if you want to chime in. But I think it's basically synthesis is what they're talking about. Any last comments from the board, or Liz?
I had a comment that perhaps the monitoring approach could be compared to whatever NEON is using, the National Ecology Observation Network, funded by NSF, because that's an attempt to standardize monitoring across several observation points.
Well, one of my students was just hired, and apparently Battelle is running these programs for them, and I'll look into that. That's a good point to bring up. They're basically, I don't know if Battelle is doing it nationwide, but I know they're doing it for the Sierras, and so I'll look into that, Joy.
Thank you.
So I was just going to ask for a quick recap of the timeline. So the timeline for Component 2, and I know it's very important for the board to remain engaged and to respond quickly to products as they're evolved. So if you could just remind us.
Sure, thank you, because I think that's a key point. The ESSA will finish their report over the winter. They don't have an exact date. There is a date in the proposal, but there's certainly some flexibility about that. This is one of the reasons that we're starting on Component 2 right now, is to keep active. I know that Steve and Joe would like this report to be done by the end of August of 2020, and I think if that date can be met, it's just what Liz says. We've got to get fast turnaround from everybody. And if we don't, then Steve will inherit it. So I think it's a very important point. Jay?
On that issue of timing, as one of the remainders of the board after the mass exodus, ideally, this will be done by August, but this is a really massive effort. And it would not surprise me if there were some aspects of the review that we don't think is ready to finish by the time everyone has to step off the board. So what I'm recommending is that if, as an option, you might think of having an interim report or part one of a report of a review that we finish by August, so that there's a substantial amount of accomplishment by then. And then if you've identified some items that to be followed up on with a part two perhaps, then that having that teed up for the next board would be really helpful. particularly in terms of socializing the
Yeah,
new board and getting them on track to follow up with that.
I
review.
agree with this, and again, we're having Steve and Joe working right from the beginning on this is going to make whatever transition is needed
I mean, I realize
easier.
breaking it up into a part one and a part two is going to be
Right.
awkward, but it might be better than just holding off on the report and getting a whole new board up on the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure at this point we can figure out what would be part one and part two yet, but,
Certainly.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Steve and Joe, and I'll speak on his behalf, would certainly like to get it done before then, because we don't want to be left with a big pile of things to take over and finish. The water quality review, if it's done that way, part one and two, where they zero in on part one and part two is something that's almost a completely separate review. My own view at this stage, and it is a very, very early stage, it may be difficult to separate it up into any part one and part two, although maybe down the road it might be that there's a certain component of it, like, let's say, the social economic or whatever, but there might be a component that might be suitable then to push off.
Well, in a way, Steve, it'd be, if we don't finish it, if you take this over, it would be good for your career.
No, if we take it over, we'll finish it up within 2 weeks, and we'll blame everything on the past board members.
That happens automatically.
Okay, any other questions on that one? All right, let's move to the water supply reliability. Jay?
Again, Joe's not here. He had to be out on a phone call. We met on Wednesday.
We could do
Tom, Joe, and
invasives
I.
first if you wanted.
No, I'm not sure when he'll be back. He might be a little while.
It's at 11:30.
Tom did a really nice summary of questionnaire responses and developed an initial set of questions for in-person interviews. We've essentially digested a lot from the questionnaire. We have the workshop that you were all at with some nice notes from that. We have some ideas for initial outline for the report, contents for the report. We want to start, I think, now refining the questionnaire, the in-person interview questionnaire that Tom had, and a revision of that is now in circulation in the subgroup. We've started to identify who we want to talk to, and of course, we've identified way too many people, and so we'll probably have to shake that down a bit, and then hopefully, starting at our July meeting, the thought is we might, at our July in-person meeting around that time, we would start interviewing folks over the phone and in person. We might do a few before then, maybe to test out the questionnaire. And then hopefully have this review finished by the time the new board rolls along, even though the subcommittee is not going to be newbies. So that's where we are now. If you have any more questions, ask Joe when he gets back.
Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to the ecosystem review, which is on non-native species, and we have, I think, moved significantly forward. We're in the process of beginning to think about writing, and we've had, as you all know, we've had a number of panels, we've had a workshop, we've had evolving bibliography, and so as we met on Wednesday, we've outlined 5 basic chapters to the review, and again, this is all preliminary, and as we go through, things could evolve. But the 5 chapters are currently outlined to 1 chapter would deal with specifically the invader, talking about the science associated with the individual species, which might be prediction of invasion and invader characteristics and routes and corridors and eradication and control. That's a lot of what we heard about in our various panels. A 2nd chapter would be assessment of the impact of a particular invader. A 3rd chapter would deal with the climate change and perhaps landscape use, and how is that in the future going to impact the whole concept of dealing with non-natives and invasives. A 4th chapter on ecological restoration, and how does restoration deal with the concept and fact that you have invaders, and the fifth chapter deals in a more comprehensive way, looking at the dynamic ecosystems and the fact that you're dealing with something that's constantly undergoing changes in species composition and so forth. So we've assigned writers to each of those chapters, and in the next few weeks we'll come up with more detailed outlines within each of those chapters and then begin to write. We don't have any plans right at the present to have any more panels or workshops or interviews, but we would hold those as possibilities as we evolve and get further along in our thinking. But we're moving forward, and I'll first ask John, and then Dick and Joy if they have any more comments. John?
No, I think you've summarized very well where we are now. I think we are moving forward. It's hard to gauge the pace of moving forward because it's relative to the degree we were moving in the past, which was not tremendously rapid. But by that index, we're making huge progress in, one afternoon. So I think we're on a roll now. I think if we can deliver the kinds of things that each of us is supposed to be outlining and beginning to think about and write about, we'll be able to put something together and then use that as a framework for seeking additional input and information rather than the other way around.
Dick, any thoughts? Joy?
Yes, well, I'm working on the restoration chapter and having a lot of fun with it. And the format that I'm working on might be useful in the other chapters as well. And that's to make blanket statements first about how well various areas are researched, and then to think up places where research is really needed, and drawing that from experience as well as from the literature. But I'll have a whole lot of paragraphs or bullet items that will explain missing information.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. Yeah, we did talk about that a little bit too, that, all of our reports don't have to be negative, and that in some cases, and particularly in the dealing with individual invaders, at least our first perception is that the work is pretty robust. A lot of it is really good, and some of the work that's being funded now, and particularly by the science program, deals specifically with that topic, and it's really state-of-the-art work that's going forward. So, Tom, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it's more a question. I've sort of lost track of where this is headed. What do you expect to have recommendations other than research recommendations? What are you thinking?
Didn't you thoroughly read our prospectus on this? We're looking at the non-native species is clearly one of the main goals, I guess, within the ecosystem chapter of the Delta plan. And that's what we're dealing with, is the science related to non-native species, and again, assessing what is the general science in the field, and what's the science within the Delta, and are there areas that can be more, can be improved? Are there gaps? Are there things that should be looking for? And we're taking the scope of that from the individual invader kind of concept all the way to the ecosystem management level, and a changing environment concept. Just looking at our focus is all on the science, but related to non-natives or invaders.
Okay. Let me get a little more specific then. One of the things that I took away from the workshops was how complicated just defining what is invasive here. And you take something like the bass. How will you address that issue? I mean, they've become really part of the ecosystem now.
That's chapter 5, and it's dealing with the dynamic system and recognizing that species are constantly changing, and what do you call an invader and a non-native, and there's a number of other terms that can be used. John, I think, knows all those terms. But John, do you want to address that a little more?
Well, I think when you put it into a dynamic framework, then you run into this question, this conundrum of what is an invader, what is not an invader, what is a native, what is a non-native, because it's all time limited in terms of when you define the baseline from which you're operating for those assessments. And beyond that, there are value judgments that are associated with the terminology that we need to find our way around and address. But I think those are the kinds of things that we want to address and try to define some clarity for how to think about non-native species in a dynamic system such as the Delta, particularly when we look forward into the future and the dynamics are going to be accelerating in increasingly unpredictable dynamics. Then how do we think about non-native species? What are they? And what kinds of criteria should inform our management reactions to them? Is every alien species a nutria that's going to devour the dikes? Or are some of them to be welcomed? There's a lot of room for debate in there, and we can't answer those questions, but we can provide clarity about how they need to be thought about and how they need to be anticipated in management, part of adaptive management.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Vince?
You know, in terms of looking at the complexities of these terms, the literature on oceanic islands has really done a very good job on this, because they're distinguishing, you know, the things that floated in naturally versus the things that came in with humans versus, you know, all different types of things. You know, the California Department of Food and Agriculture estimates that a species of insect arrives in California every day, a new species. But at the end of the year, maybe only one or two typically get established. So there's a lot of things that, you know, we tend to think maybe wouldn't consult, that may be useful as you're getting some of these finer points of, or looking at ways of distinguishing them.
Liz?
So I just have a comment, or, well, a question and a comment about the bibliography. So I know that there's been a lot of work putting together a bibliography, a literature review on the topic, and I'm not sure how you're going to incorporate that into the review, but I guess I want to just emphasize the value of that bibliography, and to encourage you to use it, to include it as an appendix or in some way, if you choose not to embed it specifically in the review. I think a lot of work has gone into that, and that there would be a lot of benefit from making that resource available.
I
think it's being developed in exactly that way. All the references are standardized in a nice table. I think we should include it.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about that in some tabular form or some way to include it. Would we consider doing going species by species and doing sort of a literature review discussion of this vegetation versus that? Probably not. It's not going to be at that detailed level, but we certainly have been a lot of work done in the bibliography, and we would intend to include it.
So it can be what we cite in our writing plus additional useful references.
Yeah. Vince, you have another?
Just thinking, you know, it would also be interesting to add what species were enhanced by some of the flow modifications in the Delta, which in bases, versus which ones were constrained by them.
You have that list? All right, any other questions on that one? And I suspect that will be done before September 2020, so we're hopeful. We're energetic right now, as John said. All right, I think that's it for our reviews of our reviews. Any we don't have any public comment on that? No. Okay, so actually I had a schedule. So preparation for the upcoming meetings, I don't have much to say, maybe, and let Liz add to it if she wants. We have a June meeting scheduled on June 13th at 9 a.m., and that's a teleconference, and Liz will be running that as the new chair. And we plan updates on the MER timetable, and presumably we'll have updates enough to know from the MER folks so we know when our face-to-face meetings down the road would be. Our July meeting is scheduled for a face-to-face, but I guess there's some question whether or not it will be, Liz?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things in the balance right now. So one thing is we're not sure about the second presentation from ESSA and whether we want to do that in person or not. So there's some question about whether July or August will be our next in-person meeting. And then we're also, actually John and I were talking to Susan at the break. We'd like to bring to the board some information about the discussions revolving around the San Joaquin River. And
The voluntary settlement agreements that are going on related to the board's update.
right, so we thought it might be valuable for the board to get some briefing on that, and so that could happen in July or August. So my understanding is that we're going to know about the ESSA presentation at the end of this month. Is that right? You don't know? Okay. All right. Yeah. So I guess as soon as we know what's going to happen with ESSA, we'll let the board know whether July or August will be the in-person meeting.
Okay.
Yes, it'll be warm in either case.
Okay, I guess we can move to the action items. Number 9.
So from the council's chair's report, we got a question from Tracy to get clarification on the Delta ISB's role with BDCP/WaterFix, /1 tunnel. Now that it's being changed and there's going to be new environmental documentation. In terms of supporting the DPIIC recommendations from the ISB, we have John Weens, Dick Norgard, Tom Holzer, and Tracy Collier working to plan a series of talks, panels, or discussions to inform a long-term scientific needs assessment, which could end up being a brown bag seminar series. And that's also something maybe for the July target if we're still debating on whether to have that in person or not. Regarding that topic too, the council also mentioned that they hope to present an update on the climate change vulnerability assessment that they've brought up a few times at the Delta ISB meetings. For the Delta Lead Scientist report, John mentioned the Delta Science PSN update, and they funded a lot of new studies. Web pages are up, and John will send out a link for each of those web pages. Tracy made a comment about the web pages since the Delta Science PSN was a joint effort between the Delta Science program with USBR and CDFW. That would be good to somehow link those things together. In terms of other things that John will send over, he'll send over or John Callaway, the final Bay Delta Biological Goals report for the State Water Resources Control Board, and some of his articles of interest that he mentioned today. And when the flyers are done for the brown bag series, he'll send that out too. In terms of the current ISB reviews, for IEP, there was agreement to have members continue to make edits until the open of business day on Monday, May 20th. And afterwards, after incorporating those comments, it'll be circulated out for public comments. And I think 30 days will be the time frame for that. Some suggested homework assignments from today is that Steve will look into the recommendations and see if there's a way to link recommendations to the findings. But as Vince mentioned, there were difficulties doing that, so maybe Steve will see if he can have any ideas on that. Jay mentioned that a lot of this review is focused on being a retrospective, and he was going to think about adding a paragraph about the long-term future of IEP. John Weens mentioned about the audience or the for the recommendations. It is one of the recommendations mentioned the IEP directors, and he's going to see if there's a way to make it more explicit about the IEP directors and implementing this report. But I think as Tracy mentioned, there's a need for a balance because once this report is released, it's up to the IEP themselves to figure out what to do with this report. There were two suggestions that I don't think had homework assignments but were brought up. One came from Tom, was that recommendation number 7 and number 8 are linked, but there are different problems. And another one was from Joy, was that Vince mentioned that there were over 400 comments from the questionnaire, but not all of them were included. So it'd be good to clarify how they were selected. And once again, the suggested edits are due on open of business on May 20th. And I'll send a reminder out as we get closer. Did I miss anything, any homework assignment from an ISB member? For the monitoring enterprise review, based on the workshop and ESSA's interim report number 1, the Delta ISB has a better pathway on how to pursue component 2. The interim report, which is now out and many of you guys have commented on, we have Joe, Fernando, Vince Resch, and Steve Brandt looking at that report and pulling out bits and pieces that will be useful for component 2. John Weens is working on drafting a framework for conducting component 2. One of the key things from the workshop is that we have narrowed ESSA's focus a little bit on the component 1 review, where the ISB will be evaluating whether the current monitoring programs are meeting management needs, and ESSA is going to focus more on whether it's meeting the Delta plan management needs.
Edmund, just in that assignment about the ESSA report 1, Tracy is also going to look at it and is going to integrate all of them together.
Yeah, I have that into mind.
Oh, you have that?
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of part of that conceptual framework that John is working on, also thinking about the information that we collected so far, like the brown bag series and panel discussions. And we also got a suggestion today from Jay Lunn about thinking about whether there's going to be a part 1, part 2 of this review. In terms of Tracy's assignment, he was going to integrate the conceptual framework and the interim lessons learned report that the 3 members pull out and try to create some sort of table of contents. In terms of component 1, what ESSA is doing, they're integrating all the information they collected from the workshop, addressing the ISB comments from interim report number 1. And as Vince mentioned, one of the key things that they're going to work on is how to better define the social and economic parameters of monitoring. And we had a lengthy discussion about the inventory tool, and it seems like it will just be up to the council on which platform we tell ESSA to pursue. Did I miss anything, or does anyone want to add anything for the monitoring review? For the water supplier reliability review, Tom has started a list of interview questions and an initial list of people to interview. The target is to have these interviews done in July or possibly earlier. Jay and Joe are both looking at the interview questions and the interview list and making adjustments as needed. For the For the ecosystems review, Steve provided an overview of the draft outline today, which contains 5 different chapters, and the members working on that review is working on the content of that outline, and I think Joy mentioned that she's already getting started on the restoration chapter. There was a comment about ensuring, even if the bibliography isn't used extensively for this review, to make sure that it's archived or made public or an appendix to this review, so something to consider. And I think Vince had a specific question for the review leads to consider, in that to think about what species are enhanced and which ones are constrained by flow alterations in the delta. Did I miss anything for the ecosystems review? And lastly, we have another item to potentially schedule down in the future ISB meetings, and it's to get an update from the Water Board on the voluntary agreements on the San Joaquin River. Any questions or anything to add?
Okay, thanks, Edmund. All right, move on to number 10, which I was asked to give reflections as the outgoing chair. I denied this along the way, and I finally ended up said I would do it. The first, I was extremely lucky as chair, and I was lucky because on May 31st, 2017, the day before I started, Edmund started. And Edmund is really the man behind the curtain and keeping our operation go. So I've never had to be chair without Edmund there. So and that's been extremely helpful. And then of course with Kat and now Madison working as well with that, it just makes the chairship extremely simple. So don't ever let these guys go, or we'll literally fall apart. When I started to look back at what we did over the last 2 years, you know, sometimes you think, geez, we haven't not getting anything done. But when I look back at it, it's like amazing amount of effort. And I just tallied it a little bit. We now have 4 reviews that were underway. We've had as many as 5. We've completed 2. We reviewed the science plan, the science action agenda, finished off the water fix stuff. We reviewed all the white paper, synthesis papers, did all our summary sheets, started the DPIIC initiative, had a number of panels and workshops, and initiated, I guess 4 reviews during that in the last 2 years. And so that's really been busy. But I think the way my reflection is that I have no greater wisdom than anybody else, but I think we all realize that the reason this place works is because we all have this shared openness, and as somebody just very recently told me, nobody comes to the table with baggage, and they all come with their perspective. And I think we're all willing to both give and receive criticism, which I think makes this work very effectively. It's just a very working, good team to work with. I've had a lot of fun. I think the challenge ahead is just simply going to be to maintain that camaraderie. Particularly with the transition. So I'm looking at John over there. Write this down as a to-do, is make sure who the next 5 people you bring in have one of the major criteria be that they can work together and work with the existing team, because that camaraderie is really critical for this kind of.
That's one of the required.
It should be right on the top of the list. So
it is.
So anyway, it's been a joy being chair, and I am very happy to turn the gavel over to Liz and wish her the best as the incoming chair.
Well, first of all, let's thank Steve, and then. So I just want, as the incoming chair, I want to thank you on behalf of the full ISB for your stewardship of the board over the past 2 years. We've appreciated your leadership, the insights that you have brought to the board, both in terms of your scholarship as well as your previous leadership experiences. We thank you for your generosity to the board in terms of your commitment of time and energy and inclusiveness. And I look forward to working with you in your new job as past chair. I will be turning to you frequently for guidance. So in keeping with a board tradition, we'd like to offer you a small token of appreciation, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The only reason I took this job was to get this, I hope it's still the fish tie. As a fish guy, I know this is the traditional fish tie. I shouldn't say that before I actually open it, but yes, perfectly. It's a tie with fish, and you can't get anything. What's that?
Salmon.
Oh, right, salmon.
Yeah.
I don't have my glasses, I can't tell.
Most appropriate for a fisheries scientist.
And a salmon guy.
And a salmon guy.
Well, anyway, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll put that on in a minute. We actually have one more, so thanks everybody for those, and thank you for those words. We do have one more thing on the agenda, my last official thing. Every member of the public has asked to speak. So, Tom, you want to come up? This is for the last item with public comments of those things not on the agenda. Yeah.
Proving himself to be invaluable again. I'm sorry I missed your tour yesterday when you were out in the Delta, and particularly in my path out there in the Central Delta. And I hope the roar of the boat engines didn't prevent you from hearing the collective sigh of relief that was being expressed by all of our Delta denizens, including the plants and the animals, greeting the sort of the death of the water fix, or at least the rebirth of it, one or the other. We're very relieved that it looks like we're going to have a fresh look at some of these issues, and hopefully it will be a good deal less tunnel-centric than the last go-around. I shouldn't complain too much, I guess, because I guess the tunnels themselves brought focus in more, at least by this body, on the larger issues that we're dealing with in the survival of the Delta into the future. I want to compliment all of you, including you, Steve, and the other three ex-chairmen, and all of you collectively for what I think has been to bring a voice of sanity and reason to the discussion, and probably, whether intentional or not, had a very profound impact upon what happened yesterday with the collective recognition that the path that we have been embarked upon, if maybe this isn't the right scientific word, but it was kind of a silly path, I think, looking retrospectively. And I hope as we move forward that there will be a less tunnel-centric approach to the important issues that we're dealing with, that we'll have an opportunity to look at other means of reducing demands on the Delta, which is a destructive thing in the long run, and be able to look at some of the opportunities that the California Water Plan initiatives have suggested are other sources of supply and dampening of demand and so forth in the system, so that we can move forward into the future. I'm reminded by the comment that Phil Eisenberg made when the Blue Ribbon panel was completing their work and issued their report. He said that the subject of Delta conveyance is really the last piece of the puzzle. It's not the first piece. That you need to understand the dynamics of the system and how it works before you can really plug in the appropriate mechanisms for moving what available water there might be under those circumstances to other portions of the state. And I hope his wisdom prevails in this thing, and that this new look is not prejudging the need for a specific type of conveyance, but we'll look at it objectively and afresh to see what, if any, types of modifications that we need. There have been other suggestions, there are other alternatives that should be considered, different pathways, Western Delta, export, those kinds of things that I think are worthy of some consideration at this point. Again, my compliments to all of you. It's a heavy burden to be here representing 40 million Californians as your audience at all these meetings, but I really appreciate the work you do, and hope, a couple of you said, well, it's been 10 years, and I said, well, it's been 52 years in my case when I first started getting involved in these issues, and time flies when you're having fun. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Okay, any other items people have? All right, meeting's adjourned.
Thank you all.